With me? Oh.
Yes.
So hi, my name is Tolly Jones. I am the adult education director at the YWCA here in Olympia, Washington. I mean, she, they pronouns. I have been doing trans advocacy work for 6 years, 4 of those being in Washington, the other 2 being in Denver. Have a large background in doing work not only around transgender issues, but also around Black issues. I'm very active in the Olympia and Thurston County area. 9 times out of 10, most people know me. I'm usually the resource for anything around trans advocacy within Thurston County. And yeah, I'm just really friendly and love all the people at Ingersoll and all the amazing people in Seattle. And I'm just happy to be here and be able to share whatever knowledge I can give as an old queer.
Oh, wonderful. Well, my name is Ro Yu. I use she and her pronouns. I've been in Seattle for over 20 years, plus or minus a couple years in San Francisco. I am a research nerd, so I'm usually in the background. I got into our work doing health disparities work to understanding that Black and brown folks, but also sexual minorities were at greatest risk for health disparities. So part of my work doing HIV vaccine research is to ensure that trans people, Black and brown folks, are represented in clinical research. But prior to this whole research endeavor, in Seattle, I've worked with a lot of the nonprofit organizations doing community mobilizing. So as I said, I'm in kind of the background, community engagement. So I'm just happy to be in lovely company, and you're all so pretty.
So hi, everybody. I'm Marcia. She and her, and goodness sakes, this event just fills my heart with joy. I tell you, I've been doing this work a while, well, since the 60s. And as founder of Ingersoll, I've been with Ingersoll since the beginning. And the greatest joy for me in all this work, and we'll talk more later, but it's just the people. It's the people who keep making the changes. So wonderful to be with you today.
Wow. Y'all are amazing. I'm so looking forward to this. I want to just start because our time is limited and precious. And I want to ask each of you how the world looks different than when you began your trans journey. And if there's anything that you would actually tell your younger self, bearing in mind what you know today. And whichever one of you would like to go first, I'm not going to choose one of you.
Mm-hmm. I'm more than happy to speak first if no one's feeling up for talking. So I have been transitioning, I guess, for about 6 years. I'm probably, I don't know if I'm like the youngest in terms of like transitioning within the group, but the world is so much different. I mean, I've always, not all of us, but I definitely had known that I was trans for a long time, but didn't have like the language for it. And so I think for me, that's one of the biggest things is difference is the amount of information. I remember when I first came out, the only place you could find information on like trans stuff or issues was Susan's Place, which is an awful place to get resources, in comparison to what's out there now. I mean, Jesus, Tumblr is pretty much nothing but a trans resource along with other sites, and there's YouTube channels committed to like all kinds of things, everything from trans men growing beards to, what clothes look good with what. They kind of run the gambit in terms of like information you get, and there's so much of it, and it's so beautiful to see. But for most of us that are here that are older, like transitioning or being queer in the late 90s and early 2000s was an awful time. And so I don't know if there's anything I would say to my younger self that I would do necessarily different. Everything I did, especially like as a Black trans woman, it was like done for survival and was done to like make it to this point. And all those experiences and all the struggles and everything that I went through as a person have kind of like informed my ability to be able to do real, honest, and open work. So I don't know that there's anything I could really go back and tell myself earlier other than to like affirm myself and let myself know that like it's okay. It's going to get better. I mean, we have such a long road to go, and things aren't where they should be, but it's definitely the world just in the 5 years since I've been transitioning is so much different. There's more access to meds. Avodart has a generic to it. Getting gender affirming surgeries and all those things is a lot more open. It's no longer an other. Or it doesn't feel like no longer other. Being trans is just a part of like the normal everyday lexicon and zeitgeist. And it's a beautiful thing for me to see, especially a lot of Gen Zers are just like exploring and playing with their gender and what that looks like. That it's not just this binary of like either you're a woman or a man. It's like you can be femme, you can be none of those things, you can be everything and none of it if you want to. And there's something that's so beautiful about that. And I'm super excited to see what like a lot of younger people do, building off of like the work that a lot of older queer people did to get them here. And just really beautiful. I just love the amount of information and the spectrum of colors that we've kind of seen grow over the last 5 or 6 years that were always there, but we just didn't know about them.
I'm a first generation Korean American, and I'm pushing 50. But I remember during the process of immigration, and knowing that I was queer, not knowing that applied to my gender or my orientation, but I knew that was very different. But one thing that was very clear, that even in Korea, like trans people are institutionalized. And coming to America, coming for a better life, and although transness wasn't the reason for me to be in America to liberate myself, it was striking to see some similarities between the two cultures, but also in terms of how people talk about trans people, which was very clear. I mean, the trans existence defies every societal norm. So when I landed in America and landed into the queer community, I was really unpacking the internalized transphobia that I had been burned with, not only from Korea, but also society's I think social cues that reminded me that I was the misfit, that I was not deserving or whatnot. But I only mention that because in the period of my transition, I feel like one of the catalytic moment for me was the visibility of trans people in media. It wasn't just in my neighborhood, which that really changed my life for sure, and my community. It really struck a chord when I saw trans people in films or in TV and stuff like that, because it reminded me that we weren't that less than 1%. And in fact, that we were interesting enough that we would be depicted, despite the awfulness of trans narrative that we were accustomed to. It made me feel like I wasn't alone. And I think that played a huge role in the queer community in general. I started off with, navigating in gay men's spaces, and as we know, sometimes it can be problematic. But I think looking at all the young faces I see in this room, but also as I join my community and seeing all the young people, and that's just younger than me, it's extraordinary that we have this spectrum that we can look to for not only the experience that we learn from one another, but also that there's not one truth in our experience. So I think the visibility, the energy of language and identity politics, really played an important role in how I see the difference between my beginning journey and where I am today.
Thank you, my friends. Thinking about this question, first thing that comes to mind is that there's always change, everything changes, and there's always a challenge. And certainly for me, as a kid, there were feelings. I think probably everybody can understand that, but there were feelings, but there was, as you said, there were no words, no guidelines, nothing. Nothing. Now, we know that trans has been around forever. It's just human. But I didn't know that, and I didn't have any words for it. So it was a pretty shut down kidhood in that respect. Now later, maybe I can talk about this. It's later in this event, but there were some things that happened around getting involved in the labor movement that opened my eyes to, because the labor movement in Seattle at that time was one of the few places where you could meet a whole lot of different people. Now that didn't tell me anything about trans, but it did open me up a little bit to what's possible. And then I do remember, I wound up in Europe in '68 for some of the revolutions that were going on over there. And I was in Venice one night, hippies, and sitting on a square, and I actually heard someone say that they knew somebody who made, as they would call it, I think they called it back then. I think I heard a sex change. And I just about died. I thought, it's pretty funny to hear it now, but I thought maybe I might be the only one. It took years from then to do anything about it, but it eventually came to founding Ingersoll Gender Center. And oh my goodness, the thousands of people that have educated me along the way, and we've educated each other. It's just been something. So if I were to look back, and if I could go back in that famous time machine and tell the kid that I was anything, I guess, well, okay, how about, unless whatever the horror is kills you, you'll probably get through it, and it will probably fade eventually if you've got enough folks around you. I don't know if I would have heard that back then, but that's what I'd say. Thanks.
I would tell myself as a young person, don't trade your authenticity for approval. Oftentimes we've been told how to act. Gender performative notions. It's striking how much information we receive of what's wrong with us. So, and I also nurture your tender heart. I'm a tough bitch. Despite the lipstick, despite all this glamour, I developed a thick skin, and sometimes that cynicism of the world is a little poison in the well. So it's now in this time in my life where I have the privilege to have these experiences and survive, that I can nurture that heart again and love the community that has saved my life in a way that no longer comes from pain and trauma all the time. So, yeah.
There's also something to be said about that now we actually have trans elders. I'm considered a trans elder, and I'm 34 years old. And just that it's beautiful that there's going to be a whole generation, there's a whole generation of trans and non-binary folks that are going to be, or gender non-conforming folks are going to be able to look to elders and how do I navigate this? What does this look like? How did this feel for you? And for I don't know how it was for Marsha and Ro, but that missing for and navigating all of that of just I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm doing the best that I can. I have nobody who has the same experiences or anything that mirrors that, and just falling back on different parts of the rainbow to get that support. And as we all know, that's not always the best experience. They'll reduce you to whatever. But that's the only sense of community you can get. But now there's choice. It's just actual trans people that are in their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s that have this wealth of knowledge and can not only be able to pass on this beautiful knowledge, but also be able to pass on these beautiful stories. And I think that's, for me at least, as an elder, the part I'm super jealous of, or any piece that I had wished that I had was just somebody to tell me there's nothing wrong with me, and that it's here's how we navigate this. I enjoy my position as an elder, being able to help younger trans people, especially here in Thurston County, be able to navigate things like hormones and being okay to keep fucking and moving around your gender. What does a relationship look like? All those things that you have no idea how to fucking navigate when you first come out. It's absolutely fucking terrifying. But it's just there's something that's just really refreshing for me to see, like, you know, people like Marcia and Ro that exist that are like, they're my elders, even though I'm somebody's elder, they're my elders, and being able to have that privilege to be like, hey, I see you, I'm glad that you're, you know, still alive.
I want to offer a trans man answer to that question. And what I would say is that even in the beginning of my transition, even with the research available, I could find trans women, but there was no such thing as a trans man. I could find Renee Richards or some story about somebody somewhere, even if the story was awfully represented. But there was no such thing as a trans man anywhere. And so much like many of us have said, I felt completely alone. And I felt even alone in the idea of transness. Like there was a transvestite, but it was always assigned male at birth, and there was no evidence. And so the thing I would tell myself starting out is, you're not alone. Look out of the corner of your eye. You'll see yourself. Trans men and trans masculine people have sometimes chosen not to be visible, and sometimes have been rendered invisible by a movement that doesn't make space for us for a lot of reasons. And so it's a both and, but I'm honored to be a survivor and an elder amongst elders. I got a great question in the thread that I want to ask you. It's such a great question, so thank you for that question. I don't remember who offered it right this second. Do you feel disconnected from the larger trans community since so much has changed since you began your trans journey? And I want to go backwards here a little bit. I'm going to ask Marcia if you would answer that first, because I think you're the furthest in the lineage of from when you began to now. Do you feel disconnected since so much has changed in the trans community since you began your journey?
Good question. I feel it is speeded up, in a good way, rather than any kind of loss. But I'm very lucky. I get to be still in one of the centers, one of the hearts of all of this work. I might not be doing it all myself anymore. In fact, I'm not. That's for sure. We got such a fine group around. But I'm able to see what's happening and to be part of a lot of the conversations. We would tear ourselves apart about language, I remember, for years and years and years. And some of that still goes on. And I suppose in a way I feel a little lucky that there's some distance now, and I can enter those conversations and know that we'll get through. Now I do know that some folks come back to us after 30 or 40 years, and they have not been part of the community. And for them, I do see a huge disconnect. I mean, it's like coming into a new world to discover us as we are now. Thanks, Louis. Wish you'd say more about your own situation. Right?
I am attempting to moderate and stay in my lane, but I might jump in there every now and again. Ro?
So repeat the question again.
Do you feel disconnected from the trans community currently since so much has changed since you began your trans journey?
So I have this, I'm always looking for legendary children. So if I'm talking about generational differences, I don't feel disconnected by that. But I do feel disconnected by the politics of the movement sometimes. I mean, I don't know that, Marcia, you have the institutional memory to know the ENDA not being inclusive to trans people, which for a lot of people in this room, we had this landmark decision just a couple weeks ago of LGBT not being discriminated by their gender or orientation. But as you know, that was heavy lifting. And sometimes the politics, the policy around that happens in our community, I feel disconnected. But in terms of my community, the people that I see and love, I'm a survivor of addiction. I used to be a heroin addict, and surviving that demonstrated to me the importance of accountability. And because of that accountability, my participation in community is part of my civil duty, you know, whether or not I see myself as an elder or not. And for that reason, that keeps me engaged with whoever that may be, my peers or the generational differences. But so to answer your question, yes and no, depending on the meta world versus the micro world.
Ali?
No, I don't feel any disconnect. If anything, I'm jealous. I mean, this generation completely embodies everything that like Marsh and Sylvia, you know, fought for. Burn it all down and destroy every last bit of it. And, you know, fuck everything else and put it to the wayside, and I'm here for it. You know, I've you know, prior to me transitioning, I was out in the streets of LA fighting cops. You know, but wish that energy sometimes, especially when I first transitioned, where everyone's like, you have to act a certain way, you have to be this certain way, you know, because your safety's priority. Where this generation's like, fuck it, it's all burning down already. Let's destroy everything and do as much of it as we can, and I'm here for it, and I love it. That energy, and like learn so much from them around like my, you know, internalized transphobia and stuff around like, I have to be this way, this is what that looks like. And to see younger people like, no, that shit's over. We're not doing that. We're not doing that no more. And it's like, for me, it's like, it's super affirming, because it's like, now I can explore things that like when I first started transitioning, and the trans people I first started hanging out with in like online spaces, like this is how you're trans. This is how you pass. This is what you have to do. This is how you walk. This is how you talk, and that's how you do it. And that space even mean harder as like a trans black woman of like, what does passing look like as a black trans woman? And now, like, seeing younger black trans people and how they interact in this space, seeing how they're like, there is no right or wrong way. You are who you are, and you shouldn't have to hide that. And I find that insanely inspiring. So it's less of that there's this disconnect, and more of there's this reconnect of like, I'm trying to be like you. I'm trying to be where you at, boo-boo.
It's an interesting question. I sometimes feel very disconnected since so much has changed. But some of that, I think I live in it in a very non-binary kind of way. I remember when things were simple, and I'm grateful that they're so much more kaleidoscopic. I need lots more pens and pads to take notes. And I think that sometimes I feel like I'm being pushed off the road that I helped build, and that hurts. And so I wish there were more room for both and. I am delighted by the linguistic and living changes that people have, that people don't feel like they need to be binary and identify their transness in ways that that I did in the beginning, and it was even narrower the people before me, who, you know, if you were going to be trans, you had to be straight, or you didn't get any services because you weren't really, really trans. And, you know, so it's a different world, but in some ways, maybe I feel nostalgic sometimes for a simpler time, and also really excited that we've expanded in the ways that we have. Ro, you answered the question about legendary children in the chat, so I see that. We got another question that I think is really, really great. And whoever's in charge of keeping an eye on time, because I'm not watching the clock, I'm just enjoying the conversation. This question is awesome. What is a piece of trans history that only you can access that will be lost with your legacy? And what can we do to preserve it? So that's going to mean maybe taking a moment to think, like that one thing that you were there for, you witnessed, or you participated in that you didn't really talk about, you just did the damn thing. But now someone is asking to share it with them and how we might preserve it together. Whomever would like to go first.
There's so much that I don't want to even remember.
I can speak to it. I think a piece that I was a part of was like the bathroom bill stuff. A couple, 4 or 5 years ago. That for me was my first introduction to doing any sort of in front of people advocacy. Prior, I was always like, I'm here to help the movement, but I don't want to be in front of anything, and I don't want to do any. I don't want people to know who I am. I'm just here to do the work quietly and studiously. And had been put in a position here at the Capitol where there were supposed to be several people who had, cis people and other people who were supposed to lead that, and nobody stepped up to lead that, and so it was just sort of a situation of like feeling like, oh, I have to. This is my moment to like speak up and speak on this, and lead this, and it just kind of led into me like being a more vocal, like my first steps into being a leader. Like I'd always been down for the cause. I was here for all of that, but I'd always been like, with how black trans women are treated. And, the amount of violence that we suffer, maybe I need to move quietly when doing this work. But for me, like, that was such a big moment for me. I was on Vice. I got interviewed. I'd been put in danger, but, like, through that, I'd also found this really great sense of community. And just for me, especially in Olympia, it was just such a big turning point of, like, this is the first time black trans women have been at the table in Olympia to be able to talk about these things. And me as, like, just a loud, like, vibrant person, just very much, I'm like, I don't give a fuck about any of this. I'm going to say whatever the hell I want to, and if nobody likes it, it doesn't matter because no one's going to like me anyway. And just doing, what I could and what I wanted to, and, like, having that supported. And so, like, there's always this concern. I guess that when being asked, like, worried about preserving it, it's preserved to me in some sense, but, like, it is probably the biggest piece of work, or like individual piece of like trans history, but like within the state of Washington that I hold very dear, is that like I was such a big part of that, and like being able to push for stuff and advocating for things and speaking all over the place, and basically beginning like the quote unquote legend of like Holly Jones, of like what kind of work that I do. And it's helping that be preserved. I don't know that I really need it to. I mean, if it is, beautiful, but like I didn't do it for the fine. I did it because it's the right thing to do. People should be able to use the bathroom. It's always been about like just basic fucking human rights. It's never for the clout. It's because it's the right fucking thing to do. So I think more than anything, I think I would want that to be my legacy. Is that I never did it for the clout. I still don't do it. I don't make no money off of doing it. I don't give a fuck about any of that. All I care about is like the people who come after me, the people who have to walk over my corpse will have a better head start of being able to do something better.
Thank you. Marsha?
The only thing that I could think of is going back to my survival of drug addiction. I don't know, for a lot of people who don't remember that needle exchange, the pilot of needle exchange started in Tacoma, Washington. That changed the world. That saved my life as a junkie. And so for that reason, harm reduction has been something that I live by and have centered in the work that I do, whether it's community organizing or whether it's in the HIV realm that I am in. So that's one aspect of that I'm very vigilant about, even when we're talking about safer consumption site and things like that. But if we were talking about the realm of transness, as I said, I was a research nerd. So this idea of ensuring that we are represented by number. And in order for that to happen, we need to be recognized, in this case, working with the National Institutes of Health to ensure that any clinical research, there is a space and a box for trans identity in that box, so that we are never aggregated into just not appropriate genders. And that allows for better data, that allows for funding for pilot demonstration projects. So those are the little efforts I feel. Another thing is, my legacy is just being the token, or the professional token. How often am I the first trans person, the first person of, all of these things that we embody. I feel like that has been a huge heavy lifting for every place I go, whether it's professionally, personally. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Marsha?
So I am so very proud that Ingersoll's been involved in every law, policy, well, maybe not every, but most of the law definitely the laws, most of the policies. Sometimes the only one there for years and years and years. Now it's different. Now we're together, all of us. That is thrilling, but it's 1,000 meetings on top of 1,000 meetings, on top of 100 more meetings. In the early years, I'm not religious, but I was fairly missionary about all this. I guess I am still, but there was a group of folks I heard of in Denver, so I went down there, and I remember we sat one night in a basement and we spent hours discussing whether or not we should be interviewed on an underground radio show, kind of a pirate radio thing that was available at the time. And then we finally took a vote and we said, no, we're not going to do it because we're afraid if out there in the world, if they knew about us, they'd kill us. Those kind of meetings. But really now, I guess to sum up, what I think of is the early groups, and it was all about survival. And people found us, all kinds of folks found us because there wasn't anything else. And all the survival stories, and how some of those folks turned into the people that went to the marches and went to DC and all the rest of it. That's the best part of the memory. And I'm afraid because we didn't write things down. What a mistake! Write everything down, my friends, or film it. I don't have all the names of those wonderful people who struggled and gave themselves to this. So I want them remembered, and I want those early years remembered. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Marcia, you brought up something so interesting. We didn't write things down because we were afraid to have them found because it might meant our danger. Yeah. So we didn't really chronicle in the ways that we might have because it was a risk to do so. It was also courageous for those that did. I want to lift up a precursor that I was a part of that I find getting lost in history very often. Now there is the really amazing Black Trans Advocacy Conference every year in Dallas. Well, not COVID year, but most every other year. But prior to that, in the early 90s, I think it was 92 and 93, a few of us started a conference called the Trans Sisters and Trans Brothers Conference. It was really designed to be the first convening specifically of Black trans folk. We had been a part of a number of conferences here and there, but we wanted to gather ourselves. Now, at the time, we didn't know about people who weren't sisters or brothers, and we are still working on, to answer another question in the thread, being more consciously inclusive of those that don't fit into the narrow binary that we thought we had to choose from when we started. But at the time, we had this conference in Louisville, Kentucky, of all damn places, at the Gulf Hotel. Mm-hmm. And I had never seen that many Black trans people in one place in my life. Quite a few of them are now with the ancestors. Others of them have gone in other directions. Some of them are still out there doing the thing in the ways that they do. But I think not my legacy per se, but the legacy of the Black trans community. I want that little tiny conference that could to not be lost in the history of it all, because so many things get lost. And Dawn Wilson, who's currently still in Louisville, did so much work and spends all of her time just doing local stuff. So she's a name that you'll never know, but she's a name that I don't ever want to have forgotten. And Yeshua Holiday and Monica Roberts, who you'll know from Transgrio, but it's these local folks who are in Louisville who put together the energy and gathered us up from east and west to make this thing a reality, if only for a couple of years. But I hold on to that as a memory that I would want to share and have chronicled somewhere. There was another question that came up about non-binary language. I could go back and look at it, but basically it was really like, how have we adjusted to non-binary language? And I want to start by admitting that for someone who came up in a very strict binary transness, once I got it, that there were other options, I was like, cool, how do I make space for that? I also want to share that it has been a battle in some of my communities, which are Black trans folks who are very, very committed to a very cis heteronormative lifestyle and choices. Like that is the icon of successful transness to them, is this cis heteronormative way of being. And so pressing back to have them make room for people for whom that's not the case. Queer Black trans people and non-binary Black trans people. You know, it's been a battle over the years, but I think we've finally gotten to the point where we're opening the doors further and being sex positive and body positive in ways that we hadn't before. But the journey continues. Whoever would like to answer that question about non-binary language and how that is an adaptation for you, if that is an adaptation for you. Anyone who came up in a kind of time when non-binary language barely existed?
I remember the term genderqueer specifically having attended a trans conference. I won't mention the conference only because it was a really difficult one for me personally, but I do remember my mind being blown in terms of this new paradigm, not a new paradigm, but a paradigm that for me was very new. And it made very clear to connect to my history through being an immigrant, but also for a lot of people, especially for non-white folks, like the whole notion of non-binary exists in different ways, whether or not they labeled it. So to hear these words, to see it adopted in our culture to describe the personal experience, but also then talking about culture that's associated with it, I am not only inspired by it, but talking about the difference between what the world looked like when I started this journey versus now, how'd I have those, like that paradigm when I was growing up, I think it would change everything for me. Not that I would not be the trans femme that I am today, but it would be a revolutionary moment for me that sometimes a binary world has created a very strict construct that I still to this day sometimes don't fit in that box. Whereas that non-binary perspective was, yes, I can't underestimate, or I cannot say enough how revolutionary that was for me.
I recall something a little bit like that, in that there was, I recall directly that there were so many arguments about language. And now I think it is because most of us felt that if we didn't get the language right, we somehow weren't going to make it. Because the world was saying, you're not real. You're just not real. You're not a human, you're not real. So each one of those shifts in language meant something. I do now remember another conference. I also will mention it. I don't think I will. But it was in the late 90s when we had, I would call it this, broken into the medical and psychological worlds, and we're having conferences that actually did touch on gender and identity. And there was one of those. And during the meeting, during one of the plenaries, a trans person got up and said, "I'm transgender." And that's the first time anyone in that room had ever heard the word transgender. And at that time, we were using it to mean someone who would live full-time in the gender they felt themselves to be, but not include a surgery. Language changes and all that. But that was the thing. And oh my God, you could hear the breath going out of some of the other trans folks in the room. No, don't let them know that. Don't say that. We'll never get anything. Those kind of fears. And now looking back on it, don't fear language. I tell myself there's nothing to fear in that discussion and those ideas about who we are and identity. What is will go on and become part of the world.
Thinking about the question that was posed, the notion that I'm not trans enough, that's something that the non-binary language paradigm has really lifted for me personally. This burden that I had to always confront, am I trans enough? And I do think that's a very abstract question for a lot of people, but for me, it was definitely part of the rubric of the binary world. Like, am I presenting femme enough? Am I passable? Or what have you? You know, similar to the construction of masculinity and things of that nature. Like, that, to me, was liberated with, and I only bring this up because it's more than just language. This is just, I mean, non-binary paradigm is more than just a language. It was something definitely suspending the policing that I've once felt, even within trans community. So.
Right. Good.
Yeah. Talia, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
To kind of answer your question, I think like because I didn't get a chance to answer it because of our visitors. But I think for me, when like sort of addressing like non-binariness, especially like when I first transitioned in doing like research into it, I seen like the binary gender being tied more to white supremacy, and so like my ability to like accept, non-binariness was more of like, it was less focused on like the trans part of it and more of like my connection with being like a Black person, and sort of pushing away some of that white supremacy around like what is like gender is only binary because white supremacy frames it as being binary, when we have plenty of cultures and other things that frame it as gender being not just these two, but it's all this multitude of things. So like there's different genders that are over different cultures.
I'm sorry, I know it's distracting, our Zoom whack-a-mole that Jeff is taking such a good care of. In all of this COVID time, this is my first time of being Zoom bombed, so I feel like now I've had the experience, and I can't say never anymore. I want to lift up a quote written by our own Kaya David in their incredible brilliance. And the quote says, "I feel that we might imagine an arc for our lives. But through the living of them, there are these moments where we feel the pivot point and glimpse a shimmer of who we ultimately came to be." And the question is, I wonder if you could relate to that and perhaps tell us about a moment when you felt your path shifting into the course that brought you to where you are today. Go for it, Marcia.
All right. So I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier, and that was the labor movement. And for kids like I was, school was interesting, but not quite making it. So at one point, I left and got a job, but it was laboring, and that took me into the world. Took me into the world I mentioned earlier. But there was some powerful actions that happened, strikes, and so on. And what I learned there was unity among folks that probably normally wouldn't be unified. Anyway, that kind of unity really did something to me. It's carried me in my whole life, but it also it had some effect on this whole process of identity and being. I wasn't even able to articulate that to many, many, many years later. But I think that was the core thing that opened up that, well, yes, we can do it, or that feeling that things are possible, even if it's not yet possible. I think I'll go with that for now. I want to hear the others.
You can feel free to revisit it. Ro, Tali, please do jump in.
I guess I'm having problems like processing the question. Can you repeat it back one more time for me?
I sure will try. I have it written down, so that makes it easier. I don't have to remember it. The quote is, "I feel that we might imagine an arc for our lives, but through the living of them, there are these moments where we feel the pivot point and glimpse a shimmer of who we ultimately came to be." Is there a time or a moment you felt your path shifting into the course that brought you to where you are today?
I guess for me, it would be just like the space of being able to like say that I'm trans and like admit that to myself. I know early in my life of just like battling with like being queer. I'm from Louisville.
Yeah.
I'm from Kentucky, from Jefferson County, and struggling with that. And so I think a big turning point for me, and trigger warning and suicidal ideation, was coming to that space of like I tried everything to be normal. That was a big thing for me. Is like I wanted to be normal, and I had flirted with gender and what that meant, and didn't have the space or elders or anything to kind of guide me around what that looks like, and kind of getting to this space of like I'm just tired and I don't want to do this anymore, and then kind of just giving myself space to like entertain the idea of like, well, if this is the end and we've tried everything, why not try this? And then doing that, and here we are, 6-7 years later, of being in this space of, I had so much more to offer. Prior, I did everything I was supposed to do. I went to college. I graduated with a master's in anthropology. I worked for the UN as a translator for a number of years. I had done everything that everyone had told me to do. All these things that I was told were supposed to make me happy, and none of them did. And then like every other trans and queer person just fell into drugs and drinking and, do all kinds of harmful behavior in this effort to kind of figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. Because I'd done everything everyone had told me, everything leading up to that point, the quote unquote American dream of, I had a girlfriend and I'd done all these things and none of it felt good or right, or nothing about it felt right in my body. And then getting to that end point of just like, I don't want to do this anymore. What the fuck's the point? I did everything I was supposed to. Why am I not happy? And knowing the answer, way back in the back part of my head, like this is like, I know the answer. I just don't want to do it because what if I'm wrong? What if it's not okay? I mean, well fuck it. I mean, we're here. We're going to try. We're here at the end. Why not try it at the end? What do we have to lose? And I am so grateful for being able to have that conversation myself, because like what I've always considered borrowed time, I feel like I've done so much for so many queer and trans people in the community of like being there with a lot of them, like especially like Black trans people, of being like, I don't know what else to do because we live in the United States where like you have to not only cope with being trans, but you have to cope with being Black in America, and that there's just this constant uneasiness and this constant like being treated as other. So like for me, I think I had a hard time grappling with what it meant to be trans because I was still dealing with, as a young Black person, the otherness that comes from being Black, especially in like a place like Louisville or in Kentucky. And so I think that was, for me, as a turning point of like, these two things can coexist. I can be this thing, and even in my eyes, is that if I view it as borrowed time, I can do so much with that borrowed time. Like I am alive because I want other trans people to be alive.
Mine is my rock bottom. This is a trigger warning. In 1990, most of my friends that I was doing drugs with passed away from AIDS or had overdosed. And I was living in London, and I had been dealing with my fraternal twin sister's death at the time, at a young age. But trigger warning again, it was at that time in my life where I had a choice to either end my own life or take someone out. And it was a moment when I went to what it was a needle exchange, syringe exchange, and a woman, the nurse there, she knew I was ready to make a decision that was going to change my life. I think she sensed that she knew that was going to take my life. But she gave me £1 to call my parents, and she just asked me to promise her that I would call my parents to let her know how my day was that day. And that £1 that in London, that pound saved my life. I called my mom, and it was that time where I think any parent who loses their child do not want to lose another child. And that is when the full acceptance of my family really changed me. I mean, it allowed me to grow up and heal myself. So I always look at that experience in my life as a pivotal moment. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm just letting that settle, that touch my spirit. I'm going to answer that question. I started identifying as trans in 97, and I started medical transition in 98. And it took me 2 years before I found another Black trans man. And running around at conferences and this and that, I met some Black trans women. I met some white trans men. And I met Alexander Bear Goodrum and Marcel Cook Daniels. Marcel took his own life in 2000, and Alexander took his own life in 2002. And that was a turning point for me. I had no intention of being out or visible or an activist or, I'd done activism, LGB activism prior, but I just kind of wanted to be a dude and live my life. But with those two Black men no longer with us in this plane, I felt compelled to be visible for anybody that might be following me. Particularly for those of us that are trans men or trans masculine that have blending privilege, it is really easy for us to just blend and not be visible for the people that are looking to find an elder or someone else on the journey that is them. And so that changed my willingness to be visible and be present and to stand up. And so that was a turning point for me. I was not planning to do all this stuff. This is not my joint, so to speak, but there was a way in which I felt compelled to at least feel like, a couple of toes worth of those really big shoes that were left available. I'm no way could I be like Bear or Marcel, but because they were just iconic in my view. But at least I could, I could put something on it. Maybe if a couple of guys join me, maybe we might be able to fill the void. And Kyler Broadus and a couple of other guys who choose selective disclosure, we kind of banded together and started doing some things around the country and allowing there to be spaces for specifically Black trans men to be able to find one another for support. And that was a life-changing thing for me, and where I began to see where this might go.